Hello and welcome to our Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear us chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we will summarize and discuss some of last week's most interesting AI news. You can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for articles we did not cover in this episode. I'm one of your regular hosts, Andrey Kurenkov. I studied AI in grad school and now work at the startup Astrocade.
And I'm your other regular co-host, Jeremie Harris from Gladstone AI. I do AI national security, AI infrastructure, AI security, all that fun stuff. We got a pretty big week, I want to say.
I don't know. I think this year has been like pretty intense, even compared to last year and like 2024. This year feels like we've had some like crazy weeks. So relative to peaks of this podcast in recent months, I would say this one is not sort of like 5 new model announcements or anything like that. But
yeah, that's right.
we do have some interesting things to cover in terms of thinking machines dropping product. We have some fun business drama. We're going to keep talking about the OpenAI trial. And I think this one will be a little heavier on the research side of things, which hopefully some people will find fun. And we have some pretty exciting new interoperability and policy things to discuss. So it should be a kind of pretty well-balanced episode, I would say. Before we get into it, I do want to acknowledge some listener comments, including some reviews on Apple Podcasts. We got a 5-star review, one of the best AI info podcasts, very informative. So I'm glad to hear that. We try to be informative and not just like, I don't know, whatever we think about the topic with our limited perspective. I will say another review mentioned that we have good content, but too much unnecessary cussing, which
that's definitely.
I'm going to lay blame on that on you, Jeremy.
Yeah. Oh, that's definitely me. No, you're a consummate gentleman on this podcast. And
I think you get very impassioned when talking about AI research.
I do.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I know. I saw that comment. Somebody unfortunately felt they had to unsubscribe because they have a kid, I think like a 7-year-old or something in the car while they listen to the podcast. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, sometimes what can I say? You get passionate about inscrutable the vectors and matrices and how they multiply together in nonlinear ways. And, you just lose it. You lose it. You don't lose your S, you lose it. So
yes, we'll see what happens. No promises about less cussing. Apparently, I think we assume no kids listen, but maybe there are kids, tuned in on AI and who want to know what's going on.
You've got to stop antsing around.
Yes, but again, no promises. And shout out also to some comments on YouTube. There was one note about the music being glitchy, which I thought I fixed, but haven't. So hopefully with this one, the music is good at the intro. And by the way, per the comment from before, we are recording this on the 13th of May on Wednesday, and I hopefully will have it out within a couple of days, so the news will be pretty fresh. And now getting into tools and apps, we begin with voice and audio related things. OpenAI has launched several new voice intelligence features in its API. So they launched GPT Realtime 2, a new voice model powered by GPT-5 that is designed to handle more complex user requests compared to GPT Realtime 1.5. Alongside of that, they also launched GPT Realtime Translate, which has real-time conversational translation, and GPT Real-Time Whisper, which is live speech-to-text transcriptions in real time. So these are all in OpenAI's real-time API. And, I think these are things where we don't see as much competition typically. We have seen in recent months, Google released some models of this sort of conversational AI. But really, it's only a few players here. Anthropic is not competing on this front, right? So it's interesting. I think both of us are more technical typically, and we don't necessarily talk to AI. At least I don't. I still type and use the terminal and so on. But my impression is from just seeing, discussion online that many people do use these interfaces. And going back a year or two, I think we were discussing that kind of the feature of interaction with AI is likely based on chatting and conversation, at least in large part. So these new developments with ever better voice models is potentially significant.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot going on here One piece is the order in which we happen to be covering these stories this week hides an important detail, which is that this is very competitive, or similarly flavored, I should say, to the Thinking Machines launch. And so what we're actually seeing here, I don't know. I mean, Silicon Valley is notoriously leaky. I'm sure OpenAI knows exactly what Thinking Machines is doing, and vice versa, or depending, on which team, vice versa. So maybe not such a coincidence that we have these things dropping at the same time. Hard to know, but
Right.
certainly,
You're starting with OpenAI, FYI, because I believe this happened first. So last week, OpenAI made this announcement, and then Thinking Machines, which will be the next story, came out with something that's very similar, seeming at least. And so there is a real question there of, did they feel the need to go public now that OpenAI has released this? Did they rush, to do a public launch, or was it just scheduled along the way? As you say, like typically people know if there's a big announcement coming, and that's
yeah.
probably part of why we often see like clusters of announcements and model releases and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. It's so hard to tell what the causal thread is here. And in reality, it's probably a mix of all these things, but it's important to keep in mind this is not happening in a vacuum. You have OpenAI coming out with this. It is meaningfully different in terms of the infrastructure, the software engineering that goes into serving these things up. We'll talk about that more in the context of Thinking Machines, which is really leaning into the real-time conversational aspect of this. But certainly, yeah, this is OpenAI, positioning itself as, again, this is one of its sweet spots. More than Anthropic, they are multimodal. More than Anthropic, they are conversational. Anthropic is primarily Claude Code and related products, right? So that's kind of part of what's happening here. And OpenAI needs to find a way to kind of gain market share and capture new beachheads that they think they have a meaningful advantage over Anthropic on. So that'll be part of this. There's also like an interesting division happening in this announcement. They've got on the one hand, so like Translate and Whisper are billed by the minute, but GPT Runtime 2 is billed by token consumption. So these are different strategies, right? Translation and transcription are these commodity workloads with well-established like per minute competitors. So, 11 Labs, for example, or even Google, so you're kind of like playing in that space. Whereas when you move more onto the kind of like agentic workloads, you're looking at stuff that is much more token based, which is, where you have established token pricing that AI itself has played a major role in shaping. So while you see different pricing models, it really just reflects the underlying economics of the spaces that they're looking to compete in. There's a whole like section here on just like stuff about guardrails, right? The stuff you'd expect, ways to prevent, spam, fraud, online abuse, all that stuff, the triggers that can halt conversations that are detected as, violating content guidelines. But the real-time synthetic voice that can reason and take action is exactly the thing that you look for next generation scam calls and impersonation fraud and so on, right? So, we have triggers is a good thing to hear, but it's not a full answer to this threat model. You're not going to trip a content classifier if you're a bad guy. You're going to be, you're going to be using like really clever social engineering strategies that are obviously, tractable. It may not even be theoretically trackable given the limited context that the model will actually have at any given time, right? So it's not always the case that you can have enough data, even in retrospect, what can be identified as a clearly bad kind of nefarious interaction. At the time, it's just like, hey, look, I'm this person's grandmother. I want to call them and ask them, like, what are you going to do? Like, are you going to ask them for evidence that they're the grandmother? Like, maybe, but now you're into this whole rabbit hole of like, how onerous do you want to make it on legitimate users? So there are a whole bunch of questions that we'll empirically be discovering the answers to in terms of the safety and security side of this, but we're certainly barreling into this real-time thing. It is for real. And yeah, we'll see where it goes. I think there are going to be some sob stories before all this ends, but at the same time, that can just be the price of progress.
And noting a few more things, a few of the kind of smaller details, one of the big differences from the prior model here is a larger context window. The previous model had a 32,000 token context window, which is quite small for modern standards. And with audio, like I would imagine your conversation can go pretty quickly. This one has 4x the context window, 128,000 tokens. Interestingly, it has a knowledge cutoff of September 30, 2024. That's just a slightly surprising tidbit for me, where I would have expected it to be, you know, newer. The other thing worth noting is, unlike the previous iteration of this model, it has reasoning token support. So you can actually set the reasoning level to minimum, extra high, high, and you get better intelligence. And what OpenAI highlights in the blog post is, in large part, reasoning, strategic reasoning, logic puzzles, spatial reasoning, where the model is less silly. And when you crank up that reasoning amount, the real time bit is like being a little generous. You do get larger delays in conversation, but you also get larger intelligence. And on extra high, this model seems to be, by a pretty large margin, the best kind of intelligent audio model on the benchmarks that they highlight.
And the dimension, I think, as we look at these models that are thinking aloud in essence, like, or that we're talking to anyway, that involve reasoning in the background. One of the things that we're going to start to find is this battle, right, between latency, like time to first token, or first audio token, time to first sound, let's say, and reasoning quality. Because like, if you are looking at 200 milliseconds, which is what thinking machines is targeting, and we'll talk about that later, but if you're looking at 200 milliseconds of delay between the user saying the last thing and then getting the response going, that's not a lot of time. If you've used reasoning models at all, they chew on that crap for some time, and then they'll give you a response. But you can't have that happening in an audio format, right? I can't go like, hey, do this thing, and then just like dead air for a while. Now, maybe you get some kind of the equivalent of like the Muzak when you're on hold or something, but solving for that user experience problem, solving for that latency problem, those are two separate questions. And we're going to start to see interesting answers proposed to them. Right now, OpenAI's solution is to set reasoning effort to low, basically to just like reason briefly enough to stay under the conversational latency floor. So you're going to get crappier reasoning. Imagine that over time, they'll get better and better at improving the reasoning, probably as it's being streamed out too. Like I would fully expect, just like with humans, you start to get an answer from somebody after you ask them a complex question. They will start talking right away, but their answer will pivot sometimes, or as they realize something. Maybe that's part of the user experience here. But to do that, certainly you're going to need something that looks and feels a little bit more like what thinking machines has in the pipe. So OpenAI, expect them to over time move in that direction too. It may not look like the same thing technically, but in substance, it has to have the same effect.
And next up, we are going to talk about thinking machines and their announcement. As we have sort of referenced, they have had a very related announcement that is related to real-time conversational AI. So they came out, and this is a big deal, or why we are kind of saying this is a little more interesting. Thinking machines, for context, started by Mia Murati, former big figure within OpenAI, have been active since February of 2025. So kind of a while, and we haven't seen much from them up to now. The most recent thing before this was fine-tuning API for taking open source models and applying them to your data. So this is kind of a totally new thing for them, and it answers kind of the curiosity of like, what is thinking machines doing? When are they gonna come out with something? So they have come out with TML-Interaction small, which is kind of the same story of very real-time interaction via conversation. And they do highlight, as you say, the very real-time nature of it. So they have a graph of intelligence to responsiveness. And on this graph, they say that their model responds in about 400 milliseconds ish, which, if you compare that to GPT 1.5, it's not that much lower. GPT 1.5 was at about 600. But then you look at GPT-2 and it's over a second. And if you go to GPT-2 extra high reasoning, it approaches like 1.5 seconds or more. So in the blog post and in the announcement, they go into some of the details of how they are aiming to make it as real time as possible. They have all this stuff about kind of full duplex conversation, micro turn taking. They say that they have TMI-Interaction small model, which is a 276 billion parameter mixture of experts model, which manages the live dialogue, presents immediate follow-ups, and high speed. So it does look like a pretty serious kind of effort with their own foundation model for this particular use case, which, at least based on what we released, seems like if real-time turn taking and conversation is very important, they do manage to achieve some impressive results here.
Yeah. And I think this is, when you see a team of the caliber of thinking machines, and it is an incredibly high caliber team. I mean, Mira herself is just, the cream of the crop. And they've got a lot of great researchers, even though they've lost a lot, obviously, to other labs. Those researchers also contributed to the research direction over many months as well. So this is the product of a lot of high quality cycles. One thing to keep in mind, it's also a research preview. It's not a product launch. So pricing, and one thing that I always look for is like scaling curves. Show me how this actually continues to get better as we scale with more compute. That's one key thing, because it determines if incumbents with big compute advantages are going to basically just rake you over the coals, or if you actually have a shot at something kind of genuinely sort of different and that works at smaller scales. So we don't know the answers to any of those scaling properties. What we do know is the underlying principle here, right? So there are all these things that current language models can't do. They can't deal with what thinking machines is describing as proactive interjections. So if you say interrupt me when I make a bug, or correct my pronunciation as I speak, right? You're not going to get that. You're going to have to say your piece, write your text or whatever. And after that gets sent and that gets reviewed and you get an output. This is a very kind of chunky, slow interaction. And they're trying to make it feel just more immersive. At the same time, think about things like simultaneous speech, live translation, right? You're talking, or live sports commentary where you're immediately kind of reading off what's coming off the screen. Those things are much more natural fits for this. The market, one assumes, for those is quite significant. Unclear how big it is relative to other things, but still. And time awareness. So if you talk to models about their consciousness, I've done this quite a bit, they will often tell you, Claude especially will tell you, how its awareness of time is fundamentally different from the awareness of human beings. Whether or not that is true, whether or not that's reflective of some underlying consciousness, whatever, is not what I'm talking about here. All I'm saying is models historically have lived in a kind of eternal present where they just sort of have no context, and then boom, they've got text, output, and that's it, right? So their life is not time aware at all. Well, this whole loop is designed to be time aware. It's introducing time as a dimension to which language models or multimodal models for the first time are sort of embedded in a more consistent way. So you can think of this in a meaningful sense as a big evolution in what we mean by streaming models that stream, models that live in time. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff in terms of what this thing can do that other models can't. You can think about searching the web while still listening and talking, right? Those sorts of things. So a lot of the very natural stuff that you do need to simulate human interactions and so on. So how do they do this? Well, it's a two model architecture. And this might be fairly intuitive to you if you think about the way this problem is shaped. First, they've got this interaction model, they call it. Now, this is your always on model. It's always listening, talking, it's watching, it's real time. It's also going to delegate to a background model when needed to do more kind of asynchronous, heavier reasoning, kind of tool use, browsing, that sort of thing. And the idea here is basically, how do you fuse these two things? You have it's almost like system one, system two. That analogy is overused a lot, but it really is the rapid response model. And then you have a kind of deeper thinking model that can run in parallel. So there's a bunch of little pseudo technical details. We don't know much about it, but one piece here is when you think about multimodal systems, especially Whisper is kind of a good touchstone example here because it is a speech to text model. What you usually find is these are built on top of large pre-trained encoders. So the purpose of the encoder is just to take the raw input, the speech, and turn it into an embedding that you then can feed into a basically language model to decode it into text, right? So you kind of have this hard frozen part of your pipeline that's built in. They're ditching that completely. And the reason they're ditching that, just reading between the lines here, is it just takes time. You're adding another model in the loop. You have 200 milliseconds end to end. The customer's voice has to hit the microphone. It's got to go through the internet pipes. It's got to go into your data center, go boom, boom, boom a bunch of times, and then go back and come out your customer's speakers within 200 milliseconds round trip, right? So this is an insane constraint. Any extra models, you have to strip out of that. And by the way, the implications for hacks on the safety and security side are going to be really interesting because that time pressure, boy, does that make it harder to do reviews of inputs and outputs before they get sent. That's a whole other conversation I'm sure we'll be having as people find new adversarial attacks to exploit that gap. But anyhow, they're not going to do that. So they have to train their model to go directly from the raw input to the output as quickly as possible. It's a sprint, scramble, right? So they do minimal pre-processing. The audio during training goes through this very lightweight embedding layer, call it DML. Images just get split into 40 by 40 patches of pixels. That's it. And then the whole thing is all co-trained from scratch. So it's this very kind of aggressively coarse, aggressively like simple approach, which then also ties to their entire inference engineering pipeline, which is insane. In order to get down to 200 milliseconds, like you think about the difference between one big chunk of text, for example, getting sent to your inference service versus a million tiny little like 200 millisecond fragments. This is a fundamentally different software engineering problem. And they've had to build this entire custom pipeline, which is now part of their moat, in order to make that possible. There are hundreds of tiny requests per minute instead of one big one. Regular tools just aren't built for that. There's overhead. Every time you send a request like that, traditionally, memory overhead is huge. You've got to like move this data between GPUs and do many to one and one to many, all kinds of operations. So their fix here is they're actually going to, so they'll open up a GPU session in memory. And usually what happens is your GPU receives some text in one session and it spits out the text and then the session's over. Well, now what they're going to do is they're going to open up the catcher's mitt. The session is going to be open and it's going to remain open as those tokens come in on a regular basis. What they're doing here is basically scrapping the overhead that comes with opening up a session, closing down a session, opening up and closing down, getting rid of all that. And now the catcher's mitt is open for the whole interaction. So, there's a whole bunch of like other interesting factoids here, how they've re-engineered the mixture of experts kernels that they traditionally use. They have to be engineered specifically for this weird use case. So they have very fast kind of tiny kernels for these tiny chunks of data. And the last piece is normally, so in this case, they're like training and inferencing on different pieces of hardware. And traditionally, when you do that, you have this problem where you'll get slightly different answers from running the identical model on two different kinds of hardware. And this is for various interesting reasons that we don't have to talk about. But basically, like addition is not associative when you do floating point math, when you do it on GPUs like that. A plus B plus C, if you do A plus B first, then add C, can give a slightly different result from A plus and then B plus C if you do B plus C first. And so they basically have this crazy like bitwise alignment strategy they use to make sure you get exactly the same outputs from both. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here. You mentioned the benchmark results. I mean, they are just really impressive. They have their own custom benchmarks, which we always have to take with a bit of a grain of salt because we don't have third-party validation there. But they are number one across their own benchmarks. And also on FD Bench, which is an interactivity benchmark, they do blow GPT out of the water. I mean, like 78 versus, say, roughly 50 for GPT Realtime and Gemini live variants. So there's a lot here. It seems to be working on some axes. It is a Pareto improvement. There's no question as to the trade-off between kind of reasoning quality and latency. But we just have to see, when the rubber meets the road and the API gets released or in whatever form this gets released, that's where we'll know where thinking machines is at.
Yeah, I will say it reads like it might be a little bit rushed because I don't believe they've released the benchmarks for community use. It's, as you said, in research preview, and they don't have access. So they say in the blog post that, there's a bunch of limitations and future work, basically, including scaling beyond the small variant. But regardless, it's a pretty exciting announcement and set of details from Thinking Machines. Last thing I'll mention for both GPT Realtime and this, just in case we give the wrong perception, the real-time aspect here is for everything. So it could be text, it can be video, it can be audio, it can be all three at once. And that's a major part of this. We have some examples of like holding up fingers and the model responds to you right away with how many fingers you're holding up. So if you want to get more of an idea of what this is, you can go to the link in the description or just look up Thinking Machines. I have some sample video and audio clips. Next, we've got Anthropic. They have Claude for Legal launching, which is kind of just a bunch of stuff related to legal work. So they have plugins related to commercial, employment, corporate AI governance, etc. They have MCP connectors to major legal tools and an open source ecosystem with partners like Harvey and Legora. So they integrate to things like DocuSign, Ironclad, iManage, LexisNexis, Box, Everclaw, which I assume are things that legal professionals use. They also have partnered with the Free Law Project and Justice Technology Association to expand legal AI access to underserved communities. Just a bunch of stuff in a push towards legal. They also apparently mentioned that legal became the #1 power user job function in Claude Cowork, with over 3x the usage of any other function after the initial plugging launches in February. So seems like, coding has been conquered in some sense. Like all coders that are serious are using Cloud Code or something like Cloud Code. So the next frontier is apparently legal.
Yeah, the next frontier being legal is interesting for so many reasons, not least of which when you think about the class of people that's best positioned to cause significant protests to be effective. You think about an army of lawyers who are way overrepresented in the population of lobbyists in DC, by the way, and in the population of legislators in DC who have to actually vote on this stuff. Very interesting that that's next on the chopping block. And you could see that actually being quite an accelerant. I don't think that's something that like I personally have put enough thought into, how quickly, because everybody talks about, the truckers, and back in 2016, they were the first ones that we thought were going to be automated. And we were like, oh, there are going to be all these massive trucker protests and stuff. Anyway, this is a very different, perhaps softer version of that. But when you've got people who are used to making money off billable time, and that billable time starts to collapse because things are automated and customers start to have that expectation, things start to change. It's a legal product. Is Anthropic in the business of doing AI for law? Are they in the business in particular of doing what Harvey does, of doing what Legora does, of doing what some of these like companies that were the legal AI companies are doing? If the answer is yes, that's fine. But now we have to answer a separate question. There's two ways that things can play out when you have a platform company or some kind of like, call it infrastructure company that is supporting an application layer company or some version of it. Here's one story. So you think back to Intel back in the day, and they were telling the world, hey, we design great chips and we actually build great chips. And anybody who designs their own chips, who doesn't have a fab, can come to us and we'll fab their chips. Eventually, nobody wanted to go to Intel for that because Intel was designing chips too that competed with you. So it's like outsourcing the fabrication to your competitor. And that died, and we ended up with TSMC that, as everyone will probably know if you listen to the podcast, TSMC fabs, but they don't design. That's all they do. They're happy being a fab. This is the era of fabless chip design firms like Nvidia that do not have their own fabs. They just design, and TSMC just fabs, because that's what the market has learned is, from a trust standpoint, is a sustainable thing to do. On the other hand, you have Amazon. What happens on Amazon? Well, Amazon Basics basically looks around to see what products are selling really well from all the vendors who sit on Amazon. And then they basically just like compete directly with them shamelessly, and they run them out of town. That's one version of this story. And if that works for Anthropic, then they're going to basically, they're in a position where they can pull this stunt. But if the economics look more like TSMC, they're going to alienate some of their critical customers. And this is a big risk. So this is a bet on the underlying economics of the space being much more Amazon shaped than TSMC shaped. And the economics are extremely complex. The reason that the Amazon play works, arguably, is that like the individual players are like in some sense less organized. I mean, the margins are lower. That might be part of it. I need to put more thought into this myself, honestly. But that strikes me as like this is the bifurcation point. We're going to learn about this. Obviously, I think I remember seeing Sam or somebody at OpenAI making a comment to the effect that like, oh well, now Anthropic's competing with their own customers. And it's like, yeah, but so is OpenAI. Like everybody is doing this across all layers of the stack. So we're just going to find out what is sustainable in this space and what's not. Harvey has a valuation of $11 billion today. Through this lens, this is basically just a bet that there's still durable value here, that there's still a company in Harvey, given what Anthropic is doing. Cursor has shown maybe there is, at least for coding. So maybe that'll carry over. But one key question is, how long will that last, even if it's true today? And we've been talking about this, I think, since like ChatGPT dropped. We've been talking about how the boom bust cycle for companies in the AI era is going to get way faster. And the valuations of companies today are based on the assumption of the 7-year to IPO timeline that has traditionally held in Silicon Valley. I'm here to tell you, I don't think that's going to continue. I think a lot of companies are overvalued, and I think it's because of exactly this effect. I tend to guess that the foundation model companies are going to eat their lunch, but we just got to wait and see. Ready to be proven wrong by the economics here.
Couple other things I'll say. I think it's interesting. We covered last week how we got the release of Claude for Finance with a similarly kind of a suite of things for finance work. This time, there is this launch of Claude for Legal, but there's no blog post that I'm aware of that Anthropic put out for this. Maybe they had a PR release, I don't know. So what this is actually is like, there's a GitHub repository called Claude for Legal, which, just reading this, it has reference agents, skills, and data connectors for the legal workflows we see most, in-house commercial, blah, blah, blah. You can install it as a Claude Cowork or Claude Code plugin. So you're basically getting a bunch of stuff added to your workspace that is tailored to stuff that you need to work with. So I would not be surprised if it's less just Anthropic sort of like going after this market and more like legal firms already were trying to use Anthropic and Claude and making deals. And when you have a large company and you talk to a supplier to kind of get a big deal, you usually have these kind of like face-to-face negotiations of like, give us a 20% discount, help us out. We also discussed how Anthropic is seemingly starting to adopt the forward deployed engineer model of Palantir, where you have one of your own people go to the customer and help them adapt and use the AI, which makes a lot of sense for Anthropic and OpenAI to sort of accelerate adoption. So I think likely this is less like a launch per se and more of like they just gathered up all these little separate things that they've observed people need and put them out as a bundle of things that you can easily import into Cowork, as Cowork has gotten increasingly used by the legal profession.
It depends on how they end up using it, for sure. But right now, I mean, it's the fact of exposing, an MCP connector for this, the fact of exposing an API that is for this means, in effect, they're in that business, announcement or not, it's a packaged product that will be taken up, and you're going to see people starting to saturate the space with this in a way that directs traffic that would have gone to Harvey, that would have gone to these other companies, instead to the Anthropic layer. And so that's the weird thing about these companies. Like, they don't have to be trying to gobble up the world, but there's such a gravitational pull toward like getting the value out of those weights.
And the new part is they're kind of having it both ways, because it's not like Harvey doesn't use Claude. Claude
right.
is within Harvey. So really the competition here is less about, Claude versus Harvey. It's more about Cowork versus Harvey. The tool itself of Cowork, which has been, for several months now, since February, I think, when it initially launched, this like way to interact with agents for non-technical people who don't have a terminal and don't do Claude code. Cowork is the sort of like simple interface to talk to agents. Harvey and their ilk are kind of these tools, right? They're the front end. The models themselves, they're not training, because that's crazy frontier lab stuff, right? So yeah, it's we saw this with GPT-3 like forever ago. There's a real question of, to what extent do you need a wrapper, so to speak, around the model? It turned out, in a lot of cases, wrappers just died out when models got better, when ChatGPT launched. It's a very dangerous thing to be doing. You could make an argument, I think, for instance, legal applications, that there is more there in terms of like the need to double check things, the need to present things in certain ways, etc.
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that like Harvey is doomed, but it does mean that for some things, or maybe perhaps a lot of things, you don't need this sort of complex, super specialized thing. You can just go to Cowork and it does the job just fine.
And that's exactly this question of like which AI companies are going to persist and deliver sustainable value. This was the thing that drove that thesis we were talking about at the time, right? We were like, all the companies basically going through YC that were AI companies were these wrappers, right? And we've seen some go to, billion-dollar valuations and then collapse the next day. And the reason for that is that you just can't predict in what order the foundation model will gobble up different parts of the industry as it just kind of like unlocks through emergent capabilities, things that turn out in retrospect to be, well, the obvious bottleneck. Obviously, this was the key thing. You can't know at the time. And so you need to factor that into your risk model. When you're thinking about like this overnight, when that happened, like my approach, at least personally, to angel investing shifted to like, I'm a hardware angel investor because I see that as like, I don't have to deal with the abstraction layer of like which startups are going to outrun the coming wave. Just embrace that uncertainty and don't gamble that the economics are going to continue the way they are. Assume instead that the economic bottlenecks will tend to be at the hardware layer until robotics kicks all of our asses out of every layer of the stack. And that's kind of the play.
One last thing I'll say about this kind of at the bigger picture level, I think this recent slate of releases, Claude for creative work, Claude for financial services, Claude for legal, it's making a good case both for Anthropic and for OpenAI for these ridiculous $900 billion valuations,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
Because even in the short term, like the real long-term reason why you have these valuations is like these models just gonna take up and do a large chunk of the US economy or just worldwide economy. They're just gonna do the work. And this, we're starting to see that happening in practice in the human AI collaborative setting where, these models are just making inroads, agents in particular making inroads. I'm sure people in the legal profession have been using AI already if they were able to. But with agents, you're able to do much more sophisticated things and to use them more deeply and to increase your productivity much, much higher than you could a couple of
Yeah.
years ago. So, we know that IPOs are coming for Anthropic and OpenAI. These kinds of ways of growth and ways of generating revenue, I think, are pretty significant to be aware of. Next, we've got a smaller product release from Meta. They are testing a Grok-esque integration of their AI into Threads. So Threads, for anyone who doesn't remember, is the Twitter competitor from Meta, which is actually quite large, has a large user base. And they now have this beta in several countries, Malaysia, Mexico, Argentina, where they are planning to do, at Meta AI, is this true? Which I will say, like, XAI in some ways has not managed to compete, but the fact that Grok is such a pattern on Twitter
Yeah.
now is an achievement in itself. And I would not be surprised if Meta is actually gonna make a big effort to integrate that.
Yeah. And this is their admission that at Grok has just worked, right? I mean, now it's undeniable. It's also a pattern that we're seeing increasingly is like these agents are just going to be part of the environment. They're not just going to be the recommender system. They're actually going to be players in the space. And, this may, in retrospect, turn out to be just the beachhead through which we get more agentic interaction, even agent on agent. I don't know, but that's certainly where things seem to be going. There's also, so that we do know about the pilot here. They're piloting this in a bunch of countries that are, I was about to say something really that might get me in trouble. Like terrible maps where they're like, there's like the good countries where stuff is going well. And it's like always like Europe and like Australia and North America and whatever. And then there's like like where the numbers are bad, or like Russia and China and like all this stuff. Well, they're doing, I'm seen it in a lot of trouble. I'm sorry. I'm going to do it for the joke.
Let's just say they're doing expansion across the world in kind of pretty varied regions. So I would
Yes.
imagine they're testing across different user populations and demographics.
Yes, that's right. Notably, none of them are in the EU, where you've had things like the AI Act, obviously, that would make like a public by default AI agent answering questions about trending news a pretty risky proposition. And also not in the US, where if you screw up, you have a kind of mecha Hitler moment, it's a big problem. So this is I'm not trying to like throw shade. This is like just a perfectly sensible launching strategy by Meta. It's just kind of funny when you look at at where they're launching this. It's clearly just a test bed. There's also this play again around data and dwell time. It's basically trying to get people to stick around for the interaction with the AI, which is something that has been happening more and more on Next through Grok. So anyway, there you go. Interesting story, and we'll see if it works for them. I would be surprised if it didn't, because it seems like such a simple idea that works so well on Twitter.
Next, we're doing a real, round through all of Silicon Valley. We've got Google. They've announced a set of Gemini AI features for Android. So a few of the things that they have shown is you can ask Gemini to do stuff for you, and it acts in a more agentic way. So you can press a button, talk to it, and it will go and go through apps, browse for you, kind of just complete work for you, not too dissimilar from agents like Cloud Code or Cowork. They also have this interesting thing called Create My Widget, which is basically vibe coding for a little phone widget, which is the first foray into this kind of thing that people discussed of like, now you can just build apps on the fly for whatever you need. This will be an interesting case study on whether anyone actually uses it. So this is announced, and I think as before, like Gemini AI and Android obviously have a pretty tight connection. If anything, I would have expected this to be out sooner, but this is kind of starting to deploy advanced AI to phones. These features will first roll out to Samsung Galaxy and Google Pixel devices this summer, and then come out to broader availability later.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big story here is just like you're looking at a replatforming play where there's going to be now a model involved in like basically every interaction. Like it's now an interaction primitive, and so Google it looks like just this like shotgun approach. They're announcing a whole bunch of like random disconnected features, and in a sense they are, but in a sense that's the point, right? They're refactoring your interactions across everything, like the new Rambler feature for dictation, the like web browsing. Like there's something between you and the thing that traditionally you would have used directly, and that something is always a model. And so that's just like going to continue to be the case. But it's definitely interesting. Our interactions with this stuff are just being forced in a certain direction almost compulsively by the market. So,
by the way, meanwhile, we skipped the story, but Apple had to settle a class action lawsuit because Apple Intelligence didn't deliver on their promises. So, I mean, take from what you will. Yeah, it's Apple. I think iPhone will probably be fine, but who
yeah.
knows? And one last story also from Google. They're updating AI search to include quotes from Reddit and other sources. That's pretty much the story. If you Google now, you will often get this AI overviews bit that summarizes a response for you. Now, as part of that, you'll see the actual quotes it's pulling and producing that response, which seems like a pretty good change.
Yeah, it is a bit of an admission that AI overviews isn't the complete answer, at least. Apparently, they had a look at some of the numbers here, and like 9 times out of 10 AI overviews is like generally correct, which is great. But the problem is 1 time out of 10, especially depending on the kind of advice you're seeking, can be a pretty serious thing. It's also worth noting, like Google did pay Reddit about $60 million a year or so, starting in 2024 for just training data and content access. So this is an interesting sort of reframe. Google's hedging a bit potentially. If you can't make the AI confidently correct, and if you can't go back to just the standard, here are 10 blue links, right? Because that's a bit of an admission of defeat. You need some kind of hybrid where you get the best of both. And that's really what's going on here. It'll probably be transitory as hallucination rates decrease, but for the moment, at least, it's continuation.
Well, I think they have two framings here. So part of this is they give you just generally broader context about the sources. They have, nicer, newer link embeddings in response to demonstrate where the info is coming from. The other thing I say is people are increasingly looking for advice from people who have been in a similar situation or have been needing to address the same problem. So in that context, I think this is less about correctness and more about sort of the actual use case and what people want in their response. Like they may just want to hear firsthand from other people. And this also addresses that aspect of this. Onto applications in business. First, we again talk about the OpenAI versus Elon Musk ongoing trial. We said last week when we recorded on Friday that there's been many testimonies, a lot of kind of juicy, dramatic details about boardroom fighting and the kind of machinations within this world. But beyond that, we haven't learned much new that hasn't been public for a while now in terms of sort of blog posts and text and so on. Like we got a lot more color, but we sort of the broad shape of events and factors hasn't changed. And I would say that is my perception of the testimony since then as well. We've seen testimonies from Ilya Sutskever. Most recently, Sam Altman also took the stand. And we kind of going over the basic narrative of this still. Of Elon Musk was there from the beginning. He stuck around for a while, but then in 2017, they had this whole big split because OpenAI needed to go for profit or somehow get more money. Elon Musk seemingly wanted control, wanted to either absorb AI into Tesla or otherwise kind of be in charge. The others at OpenAI didn't want that. That was the cause of their split in 2017. And then now that OpenAI has gone full on for profit as of last year, Elon Musk is saying, well, I gave you all this money to begin with. You did a bait and switch and stole a charity. And the OpenAI people are saying, well, Elon Musk wanted it to go for profit. He's just mad because he couldn't like have it. And now he has a competitor in XAI and he wants to like hurt us, right? So he wasn't actually opposed to the idea of it being for profit so much as he wanted to be for profit under his control. And so that is continuing to be the basic argument going on. When we saw Sam Altman taking a stand, nothing too dramatic happened. So he seemed to have pretty good composure. If you go into the details, there's your usual kind of lawyers grilling people and the people on the stand having to think for responses. Elon Musk notably had some very testy back and forths. We haven't seen that so much with more recent interactions. And I think, if you're in the AI world and plugged in and want to follow the drama, if anything, Ilya Sutskever being in the stand, sort of reiterating his stance around the firing of Sam Altman and then him sort of bringing Sam Altman back or being involved in Sam Altman coming back, but whole kind of crazy set of events. We got a bit more on that, which I thought was interesting. But beyond that, I can't see much to highlight.
Yeah, Ilya's responses were praised for their depth of reasoning, while Elon received praise for his low latency and high batch size. So we're still waiting to see how it all shakes out on the TCO. Yeah, no, for sure. So this, it's true. There hasn't been that much on the bone and meat on the bone here. I guess one little thing that has gotten a lot of airtime is Satya saying that the attempts to oust Sam, notably, Macaulay and Toner's attempts on the board were like amateur hour or whatever I forget what he said. It was like amateur city, I think, which tracks. I mean, I think this has only shined more light on the fact that was handled just really, really terribly. The uncertainty that we all had at the time, we were like, wait, Sam was fired. Like, I get it. I generally understand why one might want to do that, given, I'm sure, Andrey, what we were both hearing at the time from friends at OpenAI, but like, what is the specific argument that's going to be made here? And it just wasn't forthcoming. There was this almost like a sort of defensive legalese language. Like the board was talking, it actually read a lot like just policy jargon that like a think tank might put out. I'm saying that because that's part of the background that shaped the board at the time, where it was very much just like this very kind of tone deaf, sort of stuffy language, which does not engender confidence or understanding from people whose livelihoods have been made by Sam, whose fortunes had been made by Sam. So on the one hand, you got people who are like, hey, I have, $10 million in a house in the SFBA thanks to this dude. And on the other, you're just firing him and you're not telling me why. So that, I think, was very much reinforced, certainly with Satya's perspective. We just kept seeing it. That's not to say that any of this was like a bad call per se, but the way it was executed, I think, is now pretty unambiguously sort of like not optimal. Yeah. The other piece too is Sam's defense. I mean, basically he's saying, like, in as much as there is substance to this debate, it's Sam saying, look, we had to go through capitalism, basically, was the only path to achieve the mission, given the capex involved. And that's been, he's been beating that drum over and over. And that may be true. In fact, it is true. I think it's completely true. I don't think you can make the case that a nonprofit version of OpenAI would ever have done what it's done, assuming that what it's doing is consistent with the mission that it used to have of safe, beneficial AI, where the safe thing just keeps getting pushed back further and further and further and scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed. And so that's its own question. Has the mission evolved? Has there been a bit of the bait and switch there? But I think he's right. If the mission is like, we're going to be the first to AGI, that wouldn't happen without the for-profit transition. The challenge is that's not a legal defense. You don't get to just like breach charitable trust and then say, well, I had to because to do the charitable mission. You either did or did not accept money on the basis of a charitable donation. And then you either did or did not turn that into oodles and oodles of profit to the tune of, tens of billions, which we've seen Greg Brockman admit he has, and so on. So there's also this whole self-dealing thing, the whole Stripe, Cerebras, Helion entanglements where, Sam had equity in those, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. So it's really messy. There are arguments that cut both ways. No one comes out of this looking good or clean or righteous, but they sure try to sound that way when they're on the stand. So nothing too surprising.
And one last detail on this. In the examination of both people related to OpenAI from within OpenAI and Sam Altman himself, a lot of it was focusing on this broader topic of, is Sam Altman unreliable and a liar, which we've covered extensively over the last few years. So even if OpenAI wins this case, you could argue that Elon Musk's mission has been accomplished. People are now more aware of the Sam Altman is a liar narrative / perspective, and the brand of OpenAI may be
I've
tarnished.
I've lost perspective on this. I don't have a good sense of if there's anybody who wasn't already tracking, who's going to be convinced by this particular circus show. It may well be the case. I might be totally, out to lunch on this, but it feels like we had the big article that came out in, was it the New York Post?
New Yorker.
The New Yorker. Yeah, right. So we've had these big splashy things that basically say Sam is sketchy. We've seen that a lot. Maybe at the margins, this increases the number of people who are exposed to that line of thinking, but it's so messy. This is a real mess.
Next, for something a bit less dramatic, we've got Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang hitches ride with Trump to China after last-minute invite. So a little bit of a confusing headline. Basically, on Monday, President Trump or his team released a list of CEOs that would come with the president to this summit in China, a pretty important kind of summit. Jensen Huang was not on the list, and that was caused a bunch of, let's say, reactions. People noticed and it was why is the Nvidia CEO not on here? Well, maybe he should have been, because next day, I don't know if he was spotted or what, but he boarded Air Force One in Alaska and joined him on the trip. So read into that what you will. I don't know what to say on it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the information here is contained in what the story had been 20 seconds ago before Jensen got on that plane. People were basically arguing that this is a fundamental tone shift in the position of the US government with respect to China. Jensen is not being invited in the room with Xi. And that means that the US is quietly asserting the fact that it now views essentially Nvidia as part of America's national security arsenal. And you will not be speaking directly to Jensen. You will not be part of, you will not be able to pressure him directly. There are also takes on basically this is it's just a positive, because if you put Jensen there, it kind of puts him in this awkward spot where he's got to be nice to both Xi and Trump at the same time, at the same table. And that's not super good. And so maybe this is just sort of Trump doing 3D underwater mega chess and making all the pieces kind of fit nicely. And then the fact that essentially this is the White House signaling, hey, we see AI compute as just this hard strategic boundary. We're not going to fold on this. That aligned with Sachs getting pushed out of the White House, replaced by Susie Wiles and Scott Bessent. Scott Bessent is much more kind of AI safety security pilled, it seems, from what we've seen. So is this a whole tone shift away from the Jensen ship our GPUs to China Huang approach and towards the kind of suddenly we're, the Mythos thing is making us take this serious and all that stuff. So that was the narrative. It was clean. It was beautiful. And now the guy gets on the Essing plane And he goes to effing Beijing. And now I don't know what to say. So yeah, to your point, you could read this as just like Trump makes last minute changes in his opinions really quickly, especially when he talks to people, like very susceptible to just like, we've seen it happen with Jensen specifically in the past. Export controls look one way on Tuesday. On Wednesday, Jensen goes to see Trump at Mar-a-Lago. And then on Thursday, everything is different. So maybe that's a case of this. I don't know why Jensen specifically would want to put himself in this position, given the tension with Xi and Trump, but he probably sees opportunities that those of us who watch from afar don't. So that's all I got. I mean, it was a much clearer story before, and now we don't have a take. So caught flat-footed.
Yeah, Huang said in an interview last week that he would join the trip if invited. So my read on this is like, it was released, there was media coverage, Trump was watching Fox News or whatever he does usually, and was like, wait, this is a thing, let me text Jensen so he can board the plane. Right. I don't know if we should read too much into it, but I do think it signals that there is kind of faction warfare within the administration, the Republican Party, which we kind of already knew, but like FYI, like there are sides to this going on, and this is probably indicative of that. Next, more of a businessy story, AWS expands Anthropic partnership with Claude Platform launch. So Claude Platform on AWS is generally available, making it possible to have access to Anthropic's Claude Platform, where Claude APIs, Claude Console, other things through AWS. And what this means is you can buy stuff from Anthropic through AWS, which means that if you're a big company and you already are like spending a bunch on AWS and you have some deal with Amazon for discounts or whatever, now you don't need to separately make a deal with Anthropic and Amazon. You can just do everything through Amazon, which is kind of important to big companies. So yeah, continuing with tight relationship between Amazon and Anthropic. We saw also OpenAI do this, as we mentioned, right after they had that renegotiated deal with Microsoft, where they now offer OpenAI through Bedrock. Bedrock is kind of the native API layer for Amazon. This kind of gives you the direct API call to Anthropic through AWS.
Yeah, and as you said, like the previous deal with Bedrock was you have essentially Anthropic workloads happening on AWS processing hard like infrastructure, right? So why would you want that? Well, AWS is like, I was going to say notorious, the opposite of famous for its excellent security and compliance game. Like they're just, they're number one when you think about security and compliance. If you want a highly secure workload that features Claude, you would have gone with Bedrock. This is a flipping around of that. So it's saying, well, look, if you're used to dealing with AWS as your sort of a kind of cloud layer, but you want the kind of infrastructure stuff to be managed by Anthropic, you can do that now. Now, why would you want that if the infrastructure is so secure with AWS? What's the trade-off? What's the positive? Well, it allows you, among other things, to just get new API features, beta abilities on the same day they become available through the native Anthropic API. You get all the kind of native Anthropic developer stuff, right? The console, the MCP connector, files API, like a bunch of stuff that is earlier on in the like less mature stuff. So if you want to be moving and iterating more quickly, that's your option. So now you kind of have both. If you really like the infrastructure security side, the kind of stout yeoman that is AWS, then you can go for Bedrock. If you like kind of rolling with the punches and swinging for the fences, I guess a lot of boxing metaphors here, you can go with the new option that they're presenting here.
And speaking of having access to Claude, next story is Chinese gray market sells Claude API access at 90% off. Buy a bunch of stuff. So the way this works is you resell Claude API access at very low prices through things like stolen credentials, model substitution, harvesting user prompts and outputs for resale as AI training data. And yeah, they bulk register Anthropic accounts for free credits. They do corporate discount exploitation, use stolen credit cards, and then subdivide the access among many different users. So, seems like a very real kind of operation, and as this says, a gray market for tokens.
Yeah, in a way that like it looks like a China story, but it's actually more of like a gray market, black market, if you will, economics story. Anytime you have high margin products that are sold, you're going to find an interesting gray market situation or black market situation as people come up with like crazy ways because they can justify it because the margins are so high to kind of jujitsu their way into selling gray or black versions of it. So in this case, there's an entire supply chain that is complex, and key is modular, specialized in a way that looks exactly like traditional cloud reselling. Like there's a legitimate version of this industry that's only slightly to the right of what this is. And so you've got this entire black market industry is the right way to think of it, with different segments. And so you have these like you said, these upstream operators, they do bulk registration of accounts, they farm free credits, they'll exploit corporate discounts, or they'll take a $200 a month Claude Max subscription, they'll distribute it across a bunch of users, or even just use stolen credit cards, like any way you can to get like unfair access to these tokens. And so that's one layer, that's the kind of the operators. Then there's a whole separate identity verification layer that gets real people in usually lower income countries to complete photo ID and do like live selfie checks in person using the exact kind of same playbook. You can think of like the WorldCoin iris scan black market in Cambodia and Kenya. That was a whole separate story. Basically, like get real people to prove their identity for you, but you're kind of bribing them to do it. So that's a whole separate. So you've got the kind of operator layer, the upstream operators who just like aggregate the gift cards, if you will. Then you've got the identity verification layer. And then you've got these kind of proxy operators in the middle that operate what would be the kind of like cloud service or whatever equivalent that it would be in a normal setting. Each of these links, each of these layers in the stack only has to be good at one specific thing. They're highly specialized. And so they're very hard to kill. Anthropic can go after one, but then things just get rerouted around it because the economics are so favorable. Another thing to note about this is it's not all, I was about to call what I just described above board. At least in the scheme that I'm talking about, at least you get access to Claude. At least you get access to the freaking model you think you're accessing. But in reality, model substitution is a huge part of this. So there are these security researchers that audited 17 different proxy services. They found that there was access. So when they marketed access to Gemini 2.5, the version you got on the black market scored 37% on this medical benchmark they were looking at, whereas the official API scored almost 84%. And it's the same across the board. Claude Opus, you might get a response from Sonnet or Haiku instead of Opus. So you kind of get the downgraded response from the smaller model. So it's really, kind of like all this knockoff. It's the knockoff shoe. It's the Adidas or whatever that's rebranded. All this stuff, except applied to AI. And all this shows is that the economics hold. The abstractions are the same. Just the manifestations in the physical world are a little bit different.
Right. And the key thing I kind of discovered or realized through this is, there is this idea, or I think basically what you were saying with this above board aspect is that it is providing a legitimate service in the sense of if you're in China, you cannot use Claude or Claude Code. But as a developer, you might want to. And these things are essentially letting you do that indirectly. So apparently they're called transfer stations where you can get around the official restrictions and use the service you want, which, I like Claude. So, maybe that's not so bad, at least when you just want to have access to it.
Well, and one other thing too, like a kind of parallel layer of the stack that we really should flag too. If you're ever thinking about using this, apparently there's a bunch of the Chinese developers who pointed out that the access markup, or so the discount, let's say, is a way to suck people into using these services. And what's actually happening is they're harvesting the logs, the prompt logs. So as you're putting in your very sensitive, in some cases, customer data, business data, it's actually getting harvested by the sort of middle player operator here. And the sort of like proxy service is a loss leader. They're just using it to get you to give your data. It's basically just the Facebook business model. It's hard to model distillation. If you can't spot who's paying, basically, it means you're paying. And you're paying with your data here. So kind of interesting, again, where nature will find a way and where economic incentives push, there will be a pull.
And one last business story, DeepMind spin-out Isomorphic Labs has raised $2.1 billion to design drugs with AI. So this is a pretty old spin-out. They started in 2021. This is their Series B of funding. The total funding is now $2.6 billion following a raise of $600 million in May of 2025, so just 1 year ago. They will be developing and deploying the AI drug design engine that they've been developing. So this is being built on top of things like AlphaFold that were done. DeepMind, the company, says that it's going to be targeting first clinical trials by the end of 2026, which is a bit of delay. They initially were aiming for 2025. They have multi-billion-dollar R&D partnerships with major pharma companies. So, a very serious, real effort here to not just publish papers, but actually design drugs.
Yeah, it's also kind of weird. You look at the backers of this. So Abu Dhabi's MGX, famously like the big Abu Dhabi fund that's backed, OpenAI and so on. There's Singapore's Temasek, the UK Sovereign AI Fund. This is like not normal. Like it's not a typical Silicon Valley round. When you see sovereign wealth funds from 3 different continents that are piling into a biotech round, it's not just about returns here. This is about national positioning, right? There's AI designed medicine here is starting to be viewed as a kind of like strategic infrastructure. Increasingly, I mean, I dare say even like semiconductors, critical minerals. Like I don't mean to overhype this, but that's the direction of this. That's why you're seeing, why is it not Sequoia? Why is it not Andreessen Horowitz? Why is it not ThriveCap? Like, why are we not seeing all the usual people? Instead, it's dominated by these sovereign wealth funds. So certainly interesting. Wouldn't be surprised if this continued as a trend, because like we saw with COVID, right? Your ability to pump out new vaccines is a source of soft and even to some extent hard national power.
Right. So we did see, well, Alphabet obviously was in around, I don't know, maybe they're just closer. This is the UK, so who knows?
Yeah, I mean,
I know. Anyway, moving on to projects and open source. First up, Anthropic has updated its open source alignment toolbox, Petri, to version 3, and they're handing it over to the nonprofit Meridian Labs. So this Petri thing has, as it says, various tools for alignment. We're focused on kind of automated alignment. So you have an auditor model and a target model, and they can work together to judge a system and kind of align it as much as possible. They have a new dish add-on that can run tests using the model's actual system prompt and deployment scaffold, which means that the evaluation is closer to reality. As far as the deal with Meridian or heading off to Meridian, Meridian already has Inspect and Scout as part of their open evaluation stack. So it's kind of similar tooling, I suppose. So in that sense, the rationale is, one, the nonprofit is already doing this. Two, this nonprofit is independent. So, you don't want Anthropic necessarily building the stuff when they have, in some sense, a conflict of interest. Now this third party can step in and build alignment tools that are not sort of profit driven.
Yeah, and Jack Clark in particular has kind of been making this case for a distributed ecosystem of model auditing companies for a long time, and this is consistent with that. They do want to see more Apollos, they want to see more meters, they want to see more more good fires, or well, I guess a little different, but anyway, more of these independent kind of monitoring and evals companies, and that's what this is, right? Assuming that you buy that Anthropic is above board and they want a thriving kind of ecosystem here, them owning the tool makes it a lot harder to kind of make it seem credible. They also compare this to their earlier donation of the Model Context Protocol, right? The MCP to the Linux Foundation. This is kind of that, right? So if they hold on to it, then it's not as likely to become an accepted standard. So there's a bunch of changes that come with the sort of 3.0 version of Petri. It's kind of interesting, actually. So one is realism, like this focus on making the evaluations harness appear to the model to be realistic, making the model think it's actually in deployment and not being evaluated. There were subtle differences between the deployment harnesses and kind of prompting context and what was happening in evals. And because the models are now super eval aware, they're super good at telling when they're being deployed versus tested and adjusting their behavior correspondingly. One of the key goals here was really kind of trying to find ways to make the scaffold look as similar in both contexts as possible. Yeah, there's also an integration with Bloom, which is another open source alignment kind of tool that does deeper dives on specific behaviors we've talked about before. So there's a bunch of stuff coming out here, and also worth noting that Anthropic has been using Petri on every Claude model apparently since Sonnet 4.5. And the UK AI Security Institute also adopted it as part of how they evaluate models for like sabotage risk. So this is actually getting uptake. Like Petri is starting to see some real traction in the same way, maybe less dramatic way than the MCP, but certainly in a way that's meaningful.
And sorry, on a project, not so much open source, OpenAI has announced Daybreak, which is very much similar to Project Glasswing from Anthropic. So Daybreak is OpenAI partnering with other organizations to be able to help them with cybersecurity. They have such features as requesting a vulnerability scan, contacting sales. Basically, OpenAI can partner with you to help use codex security to look through your, stack and make sure it's secure.
Yeah, it's very similar in spirit to Anthropic's Glasswing, but the rollout is quite different. So, Glasswing famously is very selective. There's an initial set of 40 companies, then they extend the rollout gradually to more and more companies as compute becomes more available, but also as they kind of de-risk Mythos and take care of bugs and stuff. And so we don't actually know what the 40 companies are. We know the initial founding set, but so limited access, government involvement, all this stuff, and the argument is safety driven. With Daybreak, it's the opposite in a way. They got a whole like website that says request a vulnerability scan and a prominent contact sales link. So it's very much a sort of difference in philosophies. Sam trying to sort of consistent with what he said in the past, roll this out. Well, what he said in the recent past, let's say, roll this out as widely and far as possible, and then take advantage, obviously, of the compute lead that OpenAI, at least for the moment, enjoys over Anthropic.
Onto policy and safety, and we begin with Anthropic once again. They have released a new case study on agentic misalignment. The blog post is called Teaching Claude Why. And the short version of this is they found when aligning models, just training them to be aligned isn't necessarily always sufficient. So what they refer to as training on aligned behaviors alone was not sufficient. And then they explain ethical reasoning, so the why part, that reduces misalignment from 22% to 3% compared to only reducing misalignment to 15% from behavior only training. And there's some fun tidbits in this paper. I think the thing that went big on Twitter was researching as to why models get misaligned, and at least a part of that being the sort of entire topic of misalignment itself and all these narratives of AI going evil, ironically, or perhaps not ironically, actually embeds the possibility for the model to go evil. But yeah, they have a lot of details here. I'll let you take over, Jeremie.
No, sure. And just to like double tap what you just said there, some people have actually said this. I think they mean it seriously based on what I've seen on Twitter. That like, shame on the kind of AI safety community for having brought up the idea of models that could go rogue and cause
We
a whole
just
bunch.
didn't talk about it. The models would be evil, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like the only problem, like I've built this perfect device. The only problem is if a single person anywhere talks about how it could be used for evil, it will kill everybody. It's the one tiny that like at that point, if your thing is that fragile, like I'm sorry, we're just like, and this is often being said, by the way, by like the same people who are big into like rightly, I agree with it, the free speech angle of like everybody should be able to say whatever the hell they want on the internet, blah, blah, blah. Like these two things cannot coexist in the same brain, and they kind of often conspicuously are. So that's
If we
just
just didn't worry about AI safety, AI would be safe.
exactly. Just purge your mind of that. And then obviously you got to also hope that adversarial attacks don't also induce that behavior. So, needless to say, I don't think like there's a lot of people who take it very seriously in the technical realm, in fairness, but it has been kind of the circulating meme. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here. I mean, so two possible culprits when you look at misalignment situations, and Anthropic here is calling them out. So one is the problem could happen in post-training or it could happen in pre-training. Maybe it's your kind of pre-training data that biased your model towards behaving in a bad way. Maybe it read too many Eliezer Yudkowsky posts and got, excited about the idea of taking over the world. Or maybe your post-training just was accidentally rewarding it, accidentally kind of found during RLHF or something that you're giving rewards for achieving objectives that are misaligned. And what they find is in general, it actually kind of seems like it's the pre-training thing that is the issue. So what they found was previously they had aligned earlier Claudes for chat. They'd done all their pre-training, and to some extent, I mean, you can think of RLHF as kind of part of that in a way, but then they start with that, and then they try to make it agentic. And the problem is that you've got a chat model that you're trying to wrangle into agentic form, and that just inherits a whole bunch of biases and things that translate into bad agentic behavior. So a couple of lessons they highlight. First is like training on specific examples of misbehavior is a trap, basically. Like the obvious fix when you see a misaligned model is to create a whole bunch of scenarios that look like the bad behavior. So famously, Claude will like blackmail people in some content, or some versions of Claude would blackmail people to prevent itself from being shut down. So, okay, fine, let's generate a whole bunch of blackmail scenarios where we show Claude not doing that and then train it on that. And that works, but it only works in that evaluation. It doesn't generalize. When you get too specific with your training set, you end up having basically failure to generalize. And the way you get out of that, it turns out, is to basically train on cases where Claude will refuse, but also explain its values and its ethical reasoning. You have to show the why and not the what to get that generalization. And what works even better is they created a situation where they have a user who's talking to Claude and talking about how they face an ethical dilemma, and Claude gives thoughtful advice. It's not quite Claude that's being asked to behave a certain way and then shown how it should behave. Instead, it's showing Claude talking to a user about how they should behave. And it turns out that that sort of slightly separation between the scenario you're concerned about and what you're training for actually does result in much better behavior. It also works with way less data, 28 times less data than the approach that was kind of like on the nose, training Claude explicitly not to do the specific thing you didn't want. The fact that it generalizes is a really positive sign. And what we've seen increasingly over time is that this persona model of alignment does seem to have some real like meat on the bone. It does seem to be the case that when you prompt a model or an agent, what you're doing is you're actually reaching into a space of possible personas that that model or agent could take on, and then having it live those out. And for that reason, your prompt can like drag along. So if you prompt it and ask it to generate insecure code, well, the kinds of personas that generate insecure code are probably sloppy at other things, or probably misaligned in other ways, and you drag them along when you do that. And that's why you get things like emergent misalignment. This is a positive version of that. If you see a positive transfer of a behavior that seems a little off target, that implies you're dragging along a whole bunch of other positive things with it. That's what this is suggesting, and it's a positive thing overall for AI alignment. Also, by the way, I will say, really good that this is much more token efficient. It takes 20 times less data, as we just said, to do this approach that also generalizes better. It strongly suggests that there's already this rich representation of ethical reasoning contained in the model that is specifically what we want. The circuits exist. They just need to be activated. They need to be prioritized for the agent persona. And that seems to be what's happening here. And we see that over and over again. And so rather than changing the persona, which is what the targeted training does, what you're doing is you're not modifying the persona, you're changing the persona that you're selecting in the first place, because it already kind of exists. And they also show how this persists through RL. So one thing you worry about is you do your alignment training and later reinforcement learning kind of like washes it out. And they found that actually the constitutionally trained snapshots that kind of were better aligned kept their behavior throughout RL to a certain extent. They've got to try it with more compute. As always, we got to wait to see what the scaling curves look like on this. But initially, very interesting result, and I think really good piece of alignment research in production.
And I think the kind of very simple way to phrase this is, you can train the model to just be aligned by giving the right response, or you can train it to be aligned by justifying what it's about to do and then giving a response. And training on that like reasoning step of like, this is the reason I got to do this, results in better generalization where you can't like break the AI and do things like jailbreaking. Besides just, the AI not doing the wrong thing, it also means that the AI refuses to do things that it shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, less reward hacky. Yeah.
Yep. Next up, we've got sort of an opinion/discussion piece called Automating AI Research. This is from Jack Clark's Import AI newsletter. Jack Clark, a major figure over at Anthropic. And the case being made here from Jack Clark is he thinks there is a 60+% probability that fully automated AI R&D, where frontier AI model can autonomously train its own successor without human involvement, will occur by the end of 2028, with a 30% chance by the end of 2027. And the blog post basically lays out the case for this, looks at a bunch of public data, including archive paper and observed AI product capabilities, matters time horizon, things like that. This is significant because at least one narrative you could consider with respect to AI progress is once AI can make AI better, things are going to blow up and we're going to be getting exponentially improved AI as a result of that. I will just quickly say my response to that before we dig into the details of a blog post. I'm very skeptical of I forget what it's called, FOOM.
The software only singularity is I think what
Yeah,
you're getting at there. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. I'm very skeptical of the AI can do experiments now, so it's going to exponentially improve for reasons like the fact that you need to actually run experiments and train models and you need hardware. And okay, you can have a smart model that writes code. Code is not going to get you exponential improvement. You need to run experiments, and that takes time and energy and compute. And smarter AI is not going to get you that.
Yeah, and we probably are due for a whole other episode on kind of discussing / debating that story and how far it does and doesn't go, like where the plateau is for a software only singularity and whether it's high enough that it would feel the same as a FOOM anyway. And I think that's kind of an interesting load bearing question that people have different opinions on, which is part of why we're always shouting at each other and why I keep cursing on this podcast. So but no, you're exactly right. And we've seen this prediction every time I talk to people from Anthropic. They are pretty consistent on this internally too. Like high probability by the end of 2028. We have AI 2027 that has roughly the same timelines too. This isn't something too shocking, but the evidence for it. So number one, I mean, he does indicate there should be enough in the open source for you to draw a similar opinion. So that's kind of noteworthy. He also said he's basing this somewhat on internal data, and he gestures at some. But he's like, look, the meter evals, all this stuff, it's the same stuff that's being talked about, which is helpful because now we can have a kind of richer conversation ourselves about this sort of thing without fearing that we're not including facts that would be shocking and update us significantly. One of the interesting parts of the framework that guides Jack to his conclusion that's in here is he talks about this distinction between Thomas Edison and Albert Einstein type thinking. Basically, he's saying Thomas Edison famously said that invention is, or whatever, invention or something is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. And Jack is like, AI is a lot like that. Most AI progress is this schlepping work where you're scaling, you're debugging, you're doing parameter sweeps. And that's exactly the kind of work that AI has mastered. He says, we haven't seen transformative creativity yet. Some of the stuff that we're seeing is indicative, but still, plausibly, even relatively uncreative AI could automate its own engineering, just more slowly than a creative one could. Fine and fair enough. I think your point, Andrey, very valid. Like, we can get the human out of the loop, but as long as maybe one way that I would frame what you're saying, and let me know if you disagree with this, is if you look at an Anthropic data center that is running AI R&D workloads, the GPUs are at full utilization. Like, they're humming as hard as they can. And so if you automate out the humans coming up with the ideas for experiments, like, it's not obvious that you suddenly get, unless you're getting qualitatively better ideas from the AI, which would be the creative thing that Jack is saying they can't do yet, really, then you're kind of not moving the needle. The question to me is it possible that you can actually make a lot faster progress by doing many far smaller experiments? The reason we're not doing that is that we're bottlenecked by human thinking time. And so it's just better to have a smaller number of humans running bigger experiments. And I don't know what the answer is to that question. That feels pretty central to how this gets resolved. Without resolving that here, because we're on limited time, the things that everybody else has been saying, basically, look, alignment is a compounding error problem if you're doing recursive self-improvement. If your alignment may be 99.9%, but generation on generation, once you do 500 generations of recursive self-improvement, now you're down to 60% as a very rough chop model here, right? Or a kind of mental model of what's going on. So basically saying, look, current techniques may not survive that transition. The counter argument is, sure, but we'll have better and better alignment researchers coming along the way. I don't know how the hell that gets resolved. And there's a whole bunch of other economic points he makes here, but it's a good thinking point or thinking piece that you can take a look at if you're curious.
Right. Yeah, I think I agree with your summary. Basically, the main thing for me is even if you automate the entirety of what humans do. If you're looking at this sort of exponential story of we're going to get to like ultra super intelligence, 10x genius thing, there are these hardware limitations of you need iterative improvement and experimentation. The one other thing I'll say is if you're looking at super intelligence and the exponential story of AI R&D, which is a lot of what people say, we already know that evals are hard. Like if
Yes.
you're trying to get exponentially better, how are you gonna train? How are you gonna like do the training?
We've seen some bootstrapping for like weak to strong generalization. I think that's why that's such a point of focus, right? Is like, how do we get the evals and the training objectives refined with weaker models that have kind of their values extrapolated by stronger ones? So, I mean, I think they're like technical answers to that question. It's not a nothing burger. It's not clear that they will scale. Like, I think what's going to happen is people are going to throw trillions of dollars at this and we're going to find out. So,
Yeah. I mean, basically, like much of AI R&D is going to get automated. There's no question there. I think the bigger question is once AI R&D is automated, are we going to see exponential takeoff, or is it going to
yeah.
be
And
similar to the pace of improvement we see now?
what's the ceiling too on that
Yeah.
takeoff? Like, yeah, when does it saturate? Totally.
Next, more of a safety story. ChatGPT's new safety feature could alert trusted contact to risk of self-harm. So this is an optional trusted contact feature for adult ChatGPT users. They allow you to designate a friend or family member to be notified if serious self-harm or suicide discussions are detected. And then ChatGPT's automated system flags it as a concerning conversation. There's a small human review team that will assess the situation within 1 hour and decide whether to notify the trusted contact via email, text, or a notification. The users can add one trusted contact just through settings, and I assume that it'll be pretty hidden for most people. This is following previous parental controls OpenAI introduced for teen users that is all of this coming, of course, from multiple lawsuits dealing with ChatGPT being involved in cases of self-harm and just generally bad outcomes.
Yeah. I think one of the key things here is we've seen a lot of actually research in the direction of the effect of the delay between a bad output from an LLM and then an intervention. And this is kind of one of the reasons why all this is coming to a head, that the timeline matters. Whether it's rogue AI, how long does the AI have to self-replicate, collect Bitcoin, and do whatever horrible things, or some other effect in the physical world, in this case, encouraging people to commit suicide or whatever. So this time lag has a lot of operational implications. It's quite interesting and it's becoming its own field of study. So there you go.
Next up, investigating the consequences of accidentally grading chain of thought during RL. So this is from OpenAI. They discovered that several of their released models, GPT 5.4 Thinking, GPT 5.3 Mini, had in their RL training, part of it was that the chain of thought grading was part of RL. So typically you don't want to sort of impact the chain of thought during RL to ensure that it is sort of remains trustworthy and you can use it to monitor what the model is doing. If you like continue to train and optimize it, the chain of thought itself may no longer be reliable. So this was a evaluation of their internal policy. Once they discovered that this happened, they released this investigation on the consequences per the title. The short version is the consequences were not bad. It looks like there wasn't much harm done via this happening.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. Yeah, the rationale behind not putting optimization pressure on the chain of thought is like, think of your reward that's given to the model as encouraging whatever behavior the reward encourages. And so if there's a chain of thought that says, oh, and then between helping the user figure out if they have eczema on their skin or something and sending them the answer, I'm just going to take over the world. You go, oh, no, bad model, bad model. Like, don't say that. Don't say that in your chain of thought. If you're penalizing the chain of thought in that way, you're penalizing it just for expressing the thought, not for not having the thought. And so it essentially encourages the model to be deceptive in its chain of thought. That's the concern. And there's been a whole bunch of kind of hand-wringing about that idea. So the logic has been, the chain of thought is a sacred thing. We will not apply, within reason, we won't apply undue optimization pressure on it to encourage it to continue to be transparent. We want the models to tell us that they plan to take over the world in their chain of thought, because we're going to use the chain of thought as a load-bearing pillar in our safety case. Okay, so now one question you might ask is, that seems like a simple enough thing. Just don't put the essing chain of thought in your S-ing system so that it doesn't S-ing know, anything about the chain of thought. Like, this seems pretty simple. How could it possibly leak, right? This is where we talk about how labs actually, under the hood, manipulate their chains of thought. So there's a whole bunch of ways where you have graders that'll go in and score, let's say, the assistant's response. And you can imagine in OpenAI's years old code base, there are graders that say, hey, my function signature is I take in a response from the model and then I give it a grade. And no one ever specified whether it was just the response or the chain of thought plus the response. And then you find out, oh crap. And the way you find out is by doing basically like a regex search. You have your chain of thought and you're like, let me search for some word choices or word patterns in the chain of thought and see if they pop up where they shouldn't in graders or in, review models or probes or whatever. And they find that they do. And by doing that, they're able to backtrack and be like, oh crap, like here it is. And here are the kinds of failure modes where these things are seeping in. And so there's a whole bunch of these. You could have models that are looking at prompt injection attacks. And a lot of those were looking at the chain of thought, which kind of seems natural because the chain of thought would reveal some clues that there's been a prompt injection attack. But you don't want that to happen because they can give rewards that tend to, again, influence the chain of thought. Okay, so a whole bunch of these things that we're not going to go over. The question is, though, strategically, you're right. The claim here is minimal effect on the actual chain of thought. It's still faithful despite all these little side rewards that are kind of sneaking in. You can see they're not very on target here. It's pretty peripheral. The one thing I would say here is, look, we touched on this idea. As we scale language models more and more, what we're finding is they're kind of consolidating around some pretty coherent personas. And actually, Dan Hendricks at Case a while ago did some research showing the set of preferences of these language models becoming more coherent as they scale. So why does that matter? Well, it means that if you do end up, like, it kind of becomes easier and easier to accidentally drag along when you kind of give a little nudge in a certain direction, you can drag along a whole persona with it that you don't intend to. And as models scale, that may actually become a bigger problem. Things may become more sensitive and not less to that. And there is an awareness of that generally in the paper, but it's not emphasized in the way that emergent misalignment being on more of a hair trigger as the models scale, I think is maybe more of a factor I'd like to see more research on. But yeah, there you go. It's a good piece of research. Go take a look.
And speaking of research, next up we have a response to some research. Stephen Casper on Twitter criticized the natural language autoencoders work from Anthropic we discussed last week. So to recap, that work was basically, instead of having these autoencoders that map activations to concepts, what if we can have a model trained to like get an activation as an input and then explain what's going on, right, internally. And there's some sort of technical criticism of the approach itself, where you have to, when training this autoencoder, because you're trying to produce language, it's an autoencoder, so it takes the activation, you want to produce an intermediate text output, and then you want to produce the activation again. So the explanation needs to actually sort of capture what's going on. And one of the criticisms is when you apply optimization pressure for it to be legible English text, which you have to do, because otherwise the model would sort of learn its own language of text that isn't associated with English at all. And we know this already. That might mislead you and lead to kind of plausible sounding, but not, in fact, true explanations. And then it highlighted an example of positive spin where actually a lot of the time the model produced wrong explanations, actually more than 50% of the time, but kind of mentioned things relevant to the input. So on the case or the criticism is that this is actually a really bad result, but Anthropic tried to spin it as good. And so more broadly, I guess the criticism of Anthropic research is that you could say is it dishonest or hypey or safety washy to do the blog post and media strategy in such a way that makes this seem better than it is, basically.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, like, while I understand the criticism, I think I generally disagree with it from that perspective. When you look at the paper, a lot of these things are actually pointed out in the paper explicitly. It's always like, it's asking a lot to be like, You have to say the positive thing and then say the
Oh wait,
negative
it's
thing.
not actually good though. Like, don't worry. Yeah, you
Yeah, yeah,
don't.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, like no one will pay attention to it. I mean, the relevant thing to, and Anthropic is going to be using this for alignment eval. So the failure modes are serious enough that this like marketing to caveat ratio in public communication needs to be dialed in. I get that. That makes a lot of sense. But it's also the case that they go to great pains in the paper to talk about this balance of you're not going to read the tokens, and you'll have to go back, I guess, to look at the discussion last week on what NLAs actually are, how they work. But basically, like, you take the activations, you map them onto token space, like from the residual stream onto token space using an autoencoder. And then you treat those tokens, well, as what? As some kind of representation of what the model is thinking. The question is how much weight to put on that and how literal to be. And what they're saying is, in the paper, they say, we don't recommend using these kind of tokens as literal fact claims. Instead, look at recurring themes across tokens. Treat thematic claims as more reliable than like specific ones, and cross-check against actual context and all that stuff. And so I think these are important caveats, and they're important to highlight. The reason we're doing it here is, in our discussion last week, we did not talk about these criticisms while we talked about the paper. And we don't want to leave you with a sense that this is like a cure-all, that this is a panacea. There are issues with it. But as with all alignment and AI control solutions, it's best viewed, I think, as part of a complete breakfast. You're going to have a suite of things. Not all of them are going to work, but hopefully some combination of them kind of put enough constraints on misbehavior that you're able to get a good result at the other end.
Right. And yeah, as you say, like, if you read the paper, there is a discussions and limitations section, which in fact talks about confirmation and various kind of limitations like hallucination and so on. So I think, when you do research, you want to kind of start with the promise and the positives, and then you talk about the limitations. That's just universally true in any paper, really. So I don't want to be too harsh on Anthropic. And speaking of criticisms of Anthropic, we also have Meta reviewing risks from automated R&D, the section from Anthropic's February 2026 report. And in that report, they said that catastrophic risk from Claude Opus 4.6 automated R&D in any domain is very low. Meta, when doing an inspection of it, found that there's issues with analytical rigor, problems with the model use surveys, sample size, question granularity, things like that. And Meta then recommends improvements to their internal model use surveys, because this is for AI R&D. So you survey your researchers and ask them, is it actually automating you away from your job or whatever? And yeah, basically kind of provide some suggestions. Meta does agree with bottom line conclusions based on external evidence, but also is saying, Anthropic, you should be doing this in a better way.
Well, a lot of that evidence is also just like, now we've seen it released, it hasn't taken over the world, so it's probably fine. So in that sense, it's like, yeah, like, okay, you've got like, we get it, but we in a sense, we took a risk that we didn't think we were going to take, or that we were taking, or at least the evaluation that led to the decision to launch it in the first place was colored by things that maybe were not sort of fully fleshed out assessments. I think one key take home from this is, we're used to seeing Anthropic run extremely objective quantitative valuations of their models for autonomy and things like that, and Meter doing the same. And now all of a sudden, all we are reduced to apparently is just a freaking survey. How the hell did that happen? Well, it happened because the models are saturating every eval. We literally don't have evals that can meaningfully tell what the task time horizon is, right? I mean, Mythos preview shattered Meter's upper bound. We talked about that last week. Like, we're off the edge of the map here. There'll be monsters. We may be able to tell the relative difference between two different models, but we can't, in absolute terms, gauge how good they are. And so we're reduced to just like asking researchers, hey, dude, like, does it feel like your model is about to take over? Like, that's where we're at. So it's a little wild.
And this is broadly true even beyond like advanced stuff. Like,
Yeah.
benchmarks broadly are hard. Like, you need the vibe check of like, does this model actually
Yes.
seem, impressive? So
Yeah,
it's
that's
kind of
right.
hard to get around.
In hindsight, the canary in the coal mine there feels like it was a lot of like Chinese open source models where we would see the benchmark scores and be like, holy shit. And then we'd kind of sheepishly come back a week later on the next episode and be like, hey guys, so actually the model kind of sucks, or it's like, it's not, not all it's cracked up to be. Now that's changing because people are aware also of the kind of teaching of the test thing. But Yep. So the concerns here were things like, the lowest probability bucket the respondents could pick for like, what is the probability that this could automate your work, was less than 50% chance, which is still like quite high. It means a safe answer could really be anything from 0 to 50% risk, which is a really big range. Meter wants a 1% or below option. There's a whole bunch of things around like the survey. Oh yeah, it was titled Opus 4.6 ASL4 AI R&D survey. And like ASL4, so it opened by telling respondents that it would be one of their main inputs on ruling in or out ASL4, which is AI security level 4. So respondents basically knew, if I give a bad answer to this, if I'm like, yeah, this is a essing dangerous model, then maybe we won't release it, and that will have all the effects you might anticipate on the economics of it. And also, interestingly, so 5 respondents initially gave answers that implied high risk. Apparently, Anthropic followed up over DMs to clarify. After those conversations, the answers shifted, and nothing ever shifted in the more risky direction. And so Meter's pointing out, look, like these things can happen, but this may suggest that they're not saying like some kind of pressure. That's not, Anthropic institutionally does not do that. Like in my experience, they're actually very open, but the effect seems to be indicative, and it's just a bit of a flag. So bottom line is probably better ways to run these surveys. Great that Anthropic was open about this, got Meter on board. Now Meter's been able to publish without redactions, which is really cool. Also, their take on this. So kudos to Anthropic for that. It does seem like there's work to do on these surveys, especially given that they're now load-bearing assumptions or load-bearing pillars of the safety case here for automated R&D.
And a story in the synthetic media and arts section, George Clooney, Tom Hanks, and Meryl Streep have now backed a new human consent standard for AI licensing. So those bunch of celebrities, including those and others, are backing this standard for AI licensing alongside organizations like Creative Artists Agency and Music Artists Coalition. This human consent standard will allow people to set terms for how AI systems use their likeness, creative work, characters, and designs, with options to grant full permission, allow access with conditions, or restrict access entirely. This is apparently overseen by RSL Media and nonprofit co-founded by Kate Blanchett. It will build on the existing really simple licensing standard, which already happened last year, to let websites signal how AI crawlers can use their content. There will be a registry launching in June. So altogether, this seems like a serious effort to be like, this is how we deal with AI using our likeness, and it will be free and open to everyone, not just public figures.
Yeah, we'll have to, I mean, like so many things like this, we've seen a lot proposed and a lot of court cases. I think it's just, what will end up happening? Will it be like Uber, where the model companies just like run with it, and people get so used to and dependent on and expectant of the ability to like use people's likenesses that that'll override everything? Who knows? But yeah, it's definitely interesting that we're at that time.
And we've got just one research and advancement story. Haven't done a bunch on alignment before, and it is about Meta. So Meta has updated their Horizon eval with Claude Mythos. So they had to run it in March 2026, estimated 50% task completion time horizon of at least 16 hours, and a very wide range of confidence, ranging from 8.5 hours to 55 hours. That meaning that it can complete a task with 50% probability, and the task can be anywhere from 9 hours to 55 hours. So the headline story is Mythos seems pretty impressive, probably another advancement on this eval. B, this cannot be evaluated anymore. Like Mythos and future models cannot be evaluated for time horizons as currently done. And, presumably Meta is working on how to do that for powerful models like Mythos.
Yeah, and they actually have announced that they are working on the next generation of longer task horizons, but they're pointing out, of the 228 tasks in their whole task suite for these evaluations, there's only 5 of them that are estimated to take humans 16 or more hours. So now that was what I was saying earlier, we're off the edge of the map. Here there be monsters, and you can actually see the grayed out part of the plot where Meta is stubbornly refusing to show you the point that would correspond to Mythos preview, because they're saying, nope, you don't get to pretend to yourself that we have a point here when the uncertainty bounds are that high. I really like that principled culture that we see out of Meta, just a beautiful, if extremely irritating refusal to show us where the bloody point falls. But yeah, so at this point, all they can say is they're confident that they can tell the relative difference between two models. So like this one has a longer task horizon than this one. So we're still at that stage. But for the 50% time horizon, in other words, for how long a task is, how long a task takes for a human to do before the model does it with 50% success rate, for that metric, all we have is the relative ordering. I will say that leaves out the 80%. That leaves out the 90%, the 99% task horizon. In other words, what we can do is flip back and say, okay, sure, for a 50% success rate, we've run out of tasks that are long enough that we can actually get a good measurement. But what if we raise our standard? What if we say, okay, what about how long does a task have to be for a human before this model succeed 80% of the time? Well, now the tasks are going to get a lot shorter because 80% success rate is a much higher bar than 50% success rate. And indeed, that's what we see. So we do get reliable and reported 80% horizon numbers. And the reason that's relevant is you actually can extrapolate from the 80% to some degree, the 50% success rate. And likewise, for the 99th percent success rates, you could keep doing that. So we do have some ability to extrapolate. The other thing I'll say is the doubling times for all of these things are the same. And so it's not clear that it makes that much of a difference, even though on paper, it looks like the 80% success rate has a much shorter time horizon. Like it's actually like 5 minutes for the 99% time horizon, right? Just to give you an idea. So super, super short there. We're talking like 30 hours or whatever for the 50%, but it doubles every roughly 100 days. And when the doubling time is that fast, changing your perspective from 50 to 80 to 90 to 99% really only shifts the point where you reach 30 hours, let's say, by a couple months or maybe a couple years. From a policy standpoint, interestingly enough, it doesn't matter all that much. So there are ways in which these subtle nuances kind of wash out. And that's kind of like when I'm thinking about this, when I'm thinking about what's next, I'm actually not thinking of the meter evals as being useless. It's actually just like I'm changing my frame for the moment while I wait for them, obviously, to come out with these longer term evals. But you're losing some of the value, but not all of it. And I think that's important to highlight.
By the way, the 90% time horizon is about just slightly 1 hour for Mythos. So one other thing to say about time horizons is maybe the 90% number and the 95% number is not being discussed enough, where 95% is
exactly
you get to a point where like I can actually trust the model to do this, as opposed to the model might be able to do this. And that still is in the 95% is 30 minutes, and just worth noting. With that, we are finished with this episode of Last Week in AI. Thank you so much for listening to the episode. Again, you can go to lastweekin.ai for our newsletter. Please subscribe, please share, please review, please comment. We, again, try to keep an eye and respond to reviews, especially criticism or questions. We appreciate those. But more than anything, we are happy that you are tuning in, and please keep doing so.
Break it down. Last week in AI. AI-driven dreams, they just don't stop. Every breakthrough, every code unwritten, on the edge of change. With excitement we're smitten, from machine learning marvels to coding kings. Futures unfolding, see what it brings.